Christ's name we pray.
Amen. We are in a study of Revelation chapter 10. The one in the back's not lit up. Not that it's all that important, but it sort of helps me to keep from having to look back to see if we're on the same page. In chapter 10, we saw how that there is a pause between the sixth and the seventh trumpet that is to be sounded. And this, of course, is similar to the pause. Some people call it an interlude, but whatever it is a pause, just like it was back in chapter 7, when we had the opening of the 7 seals that were sealed, the book of which there was no one found worthy to open except for the Lamb. And this pause here in chapter 10 is the longest of the one in chapter 7. And the reason for that is it gives 2 visions, and each one of those visions is 2 pictures that are painted for John and for John to describe to us. The first vision that we have already looked at in the first 7 verses of our study of chapter 10, it includes, you remember, the angel, the mighty angel, and the voice of the 7 thunders. And also, in verses 8 to 11, which is where we begin our study tonight, we see the second picture in this vision, and that is the picture of the little book that John is told to take and to eat. Yep, the wrong one of them. And the second vision, which we'll not get into until we get into chapter 11, and it's very possible that we may get into the first part of chapter 11 tonight. But the second vision, with its 2 pictures, the measuring of the temple in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 11, and then in verses 3 through 13, the appearance of the 2 witnesses. So this is the second vision during this pause that we're seeing between the blowing of the 6th and the 7th trumpet. And the point of what we've been studying so far is the point of the delay is to send the message of swift divine retribution, and to also say that the delay of God's judgment upon Rome is over. The delay is over. Judgment is to be forthcoming. So we pick up with our study tonight at verse 8. And someone read us those 4 verses 8 through 11.
And the voice which I heard from heaven spoke unto me again and said, Go and take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel, which standeth upon the sea and upon the earth. And I went unto the angel and said unto him, Give me the little book. And he said unto me, Take it and eat it up. It shall make thy belly bitter. It shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it up. And it was in my mouth sweet as honey. And as soon as I had eaten it up, my belly was bitter. And he said unto me, Thou hast prophesied again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings.
All right. So we see that John eats the little book in these verses. Verse 8, there's that voice from heaven that said for John to take the book. And John is told to take the little book from the hand of the angel. And obviously, the question is, what is the message of this little book? There are some that think it's the vision that we'll be studying in chapter 11. That's some interpretation of what the little book signifies. To others, they think it's the message of the second section of the book. Remember in the introduction that we did of the book of Revelation, we sort of divided it into 2 sections. Chapters 1 through 11 and then chapters 12 through 22. So there are those who think that what this little book has reference to and signifies is really the second half of what we'll be studying in the book of Revelation. And then there's still others that thinks it's a commission. It's a commission to preach Christ, to preach God's judgment on the wicked. So, as always, with things pertaining to symbolism, there can be certainly more than one understanding, more than one interpretation of what these things might signify. But if you remember, and this is of course the point that we made when we first began our study of the book of Revelation, and that is the more we're familiar with the Old Testament, the easier and less surprised we'll find ourselves when we are studying the book of Revelation. It so happens that Ezekiel was told to eat a book. And that we find in Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 8. I think there's only 3 or 4 verses in chapter 8. And then in the first 3 verses of chapter 3. So someone read us those verses.
Go ahead. Thou son of man, hear what I say unto thee, be not thou rebellious like that rebellious house. Open thy mouth and eat that I give thee. And when I looked, behold, an hand was sent to me, and lo, a roll of a book was therein. And he spread it before me, and it was written within and without. And there was written therein lamentations and mourning and woe. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, eat that thou findest, and eat this roll, and go speak into the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat that roll. And he said unto me, Son of man, cause thy belly to eat, and fill thy bowels with this roll that I give thee. Then did I eat it, and it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness.
All right. So we see similar language in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel, of course, was one of the major prophets in the Old Testament. He prophesied during and after the time of the Babylonian captivity. Although Judah was the only nation that was in existence, yet we see, as often the case was, the nation was referred to as the nation of Israel, because indeed it was. Not that it was the same Israel as in the divided kingdom, but still Judah made up of the nations or the tribes that it was, and then of course there was the remnant of the remaining tribes. So it's referred to here as the children of Israel. But we see what they were. They were rebellious. God's judgment is coming upon them. And it will come upon them in the form of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. They will go into captivity, all because of what the rebellion against God, and God is executing the judgment upon them. And so here on this occasion, God sends to Ezekiel, he calls it a roll of a book. And just like what we're seeing here in Revelation, Ezekiel, like John, is told to eat the book. And to eat it, it would be as honey in his mouth, but then it would be bitter. And we'll see that as we look a little bit further in another passage of Scripture. Because this book was a message we see of sorrow. It's called Lamentations and Sorrow and Woe. That was true of Ezekiel's book. And it's also true of the same significance of the book that we're seeing here in Revelation. So it was a message of sorrow and woe for a rebellious nation. The nations were different, but we see similarities in the way that God conducted things. So Ezekiel chapter 2, someone read us verses 9 and 10.
When I looked, behold, and a hand was sent unto me Lowell Road book was very, he spread it 4 million, it was written within and without, and there was written therein lamentation and mourning.
All right. So again, we see the message of the book was of sorrow, lamentations, and woe. And this is what we've been studying ever since the trumpets were blown. We saw 3, after the first 4 trumpets had sounded, there was 3 remaining, and John was told, woe, woe, woe. So now we're seeing the blowing of the 5th, we've seen the blowing of the 6th, now we're in between the 6th and the 7th. There's yet one more woe to be given, and this will occur with the blowing of the 7th trumpet. So when we're looking at these books, whether it's the role of a book that's described in Ezekiel or whether it's a little book that is being described here in the book of Revelation, it too is a message. It is a message that is associated together. And again, I think this helps to prove the point that the more familiar we are with the Old Testament, then the less confused, the less bewildered we are as we do our study here in the book of Revelation. So this too is a message of sorrow, a message of woe that is being pronounced upon Rome. And I know there's 2 different ideas concerning when the book of Revelation was written, whether it was written before 70 AD or whether it was written after 70 AD. But still the common thread is it's Rome. Whether it was the destruction of Jerusalem, how did that come about? It came about because of Rome. Or whether it is what I think it to be 90 AD, after the destruction of Jerusalem, we still see Rome is persecuting Christians. So there's no doubt that God's judgment is being upon Rome, whichever time period that we take in when the book of Revelation was written. So it's a message to any and to all who will rebel, who will compromise, and it's a message even to Christians, to the Christian that has to suffer because of their faithfulness, because that's what the book of Revelation is all about, encouraging Christians to remain faithful, and here's the reasons why. God is in control. God will see to it that your oppressors will be avenged. Your persecutors will be judged, regardless of how mighty and powerful of a nation or a people there may be. God is more powerful, and vengeance certainly belongs to him. So really, when we look at the last verse of this chapter, it should help us to view this as a broad message for all people, nations, and tongues. Let's read verse 11 again. He said unto me, thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. So, John is told to take the book. So he takes it and he eats it. In what we've read in verses 9 and 10, he's told to eat the little book. And he's warned that it would make his stomach bitter, but it would be sweet as honey in his mouth. And Ezekiel book, it was sweet to the taste. Again, let's remind ourselves of Ezekiel 3 and verse 3 somewhat.
He said unto them, Son of man, cause thy belly to eat, and fill thy bowels with this roll that I give thee. And did I eat it, and was in my mouth as honey for sweetness.
All right. So in his mouth it was sweet as honey, but then in chapter 3 and verse 14, someone read.
The Spirit lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness and heat my spirit, but the hand of the Lord was strong upon me.
So again, we're seeing the terms sweetness and bitterness associated with Ezekiel and this little roll, or this roll of a book that is in his particular case. So the message was sweet. In what way? Well, it was a message from God. All messages from God are sweet. Notice Psalms chapter 19 and verse 10. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. David is talking about thy word. And so the message was a sweet message in the sense that it was a message from God, but it revealed the promise of God to avenge his people. Even that would give it a sweetness, wouldn't it? That here is persecution, here Christians are suffering to the point of death, even to death. And the message is that God is going to avenge your persecutors. So yes, it's a message of sweetness to the Christians that are remaining faithful. But at the same time, it's bitter because it contains warnings, it contains woes of God's judgment that's coming upon the persecutors of his people. So sweetness and bitterness. Sweetness for the Christians because it's a message of retribution. It's a message of vengeance being taken upon their persecutors. But to the persecutors themselves, it's clearly a message of bitterness. God's judgment is about to be poured out upon them. So the angel tells John, thou must prophesy again. And that's what we see in verse 11. See, John has ate the message of the little book. And John, when he eats the message, he says he is told, prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. So God's message of woe is to be given to all who will be rebellious to his will. Hasn't that stood the test of time? From the beginning of Adam and Eve right on down? Certainly it has. So there's always a message of woe to be given to those that will be rebellious to God. So what's the point of this relatively short chapter? Well, it's a message of swift revenge. It's a message of retribution. God is going to avenge. He's going to judge. He's going to punish the persecutors of his people. And the message is that the delay of God's judgment is over. God's long-suffering, and God is long-suffering. God is not willing that any should perish. So God is long-suffering, but there's an end, there's a limit to God's long-suffering. And we are at that point here in our study in the context of Revelation. God is at that point that his long-suffering has reached an end. And so the message of woe is being sent. Okay, you have your papers? We'll look at them as a review of all of what we studied last week and so far in our time this week. In Revelation chapter 10, verse 1, all the way through chapter 11, it presents, as we've said a moment ago, a second interlude, a second pause between the sounding of the sixth and the seventh trumpet. So this pause, this interlude, is designed to give the reader assurance that God has even more planned to vindicate his saints, although he may not reveal all of his plans to man. Remember the seven thunders? What was John told to do? Write it? No, seal it up. So there are other things that God has in store that he's not let known. So further, the Lord will simply not allow his testimony to be stamped out by the forces of evil. So describe the appearance of this mighty angel that John saw coming down from heaven. What does verse 1 say about his appearance?
Clothed with the cloud, and a rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun, his feet were like pillars of fire.
All right, and if you remember last week, we talked about each one of those, what those things signified. Remember we said in the very beginning of the book of Revelation that it's almost like a picture that John is given. And John then is giving us the description of what he's seeing. He is seeing a scene, like in a movie. Here's the scene, okay? John then describes that scene for us. And so he's clothed with a cloud, a rainbow on his head, his face like the sun, his feet like pillars of fire. And like I said last week, we talked about all four of those descriptions and what they very well could signify. Where did the angel place his feet in verse 2?
On your seat.
All right. His right foot was on the sea. His left foot was on the land. So this would signify God's complete judgment. God's judgment, when God executes his judgment, it's complete, it's full. And when the angel cried out with a loud voice, what uttered their voices? Verse 3. What uttered their voices? The seven thunders. And rather than being allowed to write what those seven thunders uttered, John was told to do what with what he had heard? Verse 4. Seal them up. Remember we talked about how that back in chapter 1, the statement was made twice. I think it was verse 3 and verse 11. That the things you see, right, but not true of this particular situation. The seven thunders uttered, but as John was about to do what John knew he was told to do, he was told, stop, don't record, don't write the things that the seven thunders have uttered. The angel swore that in the days of the sounding of the seventh trumpet, what would be finished? Verses 5 through 7. What would be finished?
That the mystery of God would be finished.
All right. And you know what we see in Paul's writings, in Ephesians and in other places, he uses the word mystery. But it's always in reference to God's plan that he implemented in his mind from the foundation, before the foundation of the world, as to how he would bring about the redeeming of mankind, the reconciling of man from sin back to God. And remember last week we went back to the book of Daniel. We saw the image that Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed and needed the interpretation of it, and Daniel gave him the interpretation. And in that, we see that it was in the days of the fourth kingdom that God would establish his kingdom that would break into pieces and consume all of these other kingdoms, and it would stand forever. So truly, the mystery of the establishment of God's kingdom is in existence. And so we see here that this mystery of God would be finished, and we talked about even how that in chapter 7 of Daniel prophesies that it would be that fourth kingdom that would be a persecutor of God's people. And again, we can take that either way, whether it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, because we know that certainly in Jesus' prophecy in Matthew 24, he refers to Daniel, to the desolation that Daniel spoke of. So we see then that whether it was Jerusalem or whether it's this persecution at the hands of Rome under the emperor, it still has to do with Rome. And so it was that fourth kingdom, as Daniel prophesied, that would still be the persecutor of God's people. So what was John told to take from the hand of the angel in verse 8? Take the little book, which is open. What did the angel tell John to do with the book? Verse 9. Take it and eat it. How did it taste in his mouth? Sweet as honey. What did it do to his stomach? Made his stomach bitter. What assignment was John then given? Verse 11. Must prophesy again to people, nations, and to kings. In question 4, the D part of that question, we're to compare this text to what we read a moment ago in Ezekiel 2, verse 8, chapter 3, verse 4, and verses 10 and 11. And really, I've given you the answer as well, because when we compare the book that Ezekiel was given and the book that we're seeing here in John, that in both of those cases, the prophet is told to go speak God's word after they had eaten, whether it was the roll of the book, scroll, I think some translations use, or the little book, as we find it here in the book of Revelation. So we see, he says, but you, son of man, hear what I say to you. Do not be rebellious like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. Now when I looked, there was a hand stretched out to me, and behold, a scroll of a book was in it. Then he spread it before me, and there was writing on the inside and on the outside, and written on it were lamentations and mourning and woe. Moreover, he said to me, Son of man, eat what you find. Eat this scroll, and go speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat that scroll, and he said to me, Son of man, feed your belly, and fill your stomach with this scroll that I've given you. So I ate, and it was in my mouth like honey and sweetness. And then he said to me, Son of man, go to the house of Israel, and speak with my words to them. And moreover, he said to me, Son of man, receive into your heart all of my words that I speak to you, and hear with your ears. And go and get to the captives, to the children of your people, and speak to them and tell them, thus saith the Lord, whether they hear or whether they refuse. So again, God's message is to be preached, it's to be spoken, regardless of the outcome. Whether it's received, whether it's not received. And remember, that was the interesting thing about Jeremiah. Remember him? Remember how he was to go to speak and to preach and to prophesy to the nation of Judah? And God told him from the very beginning what? They're not going to listen to you. But go preach anyway. You will have relieved your soul of their blood when you tell them. So I think that's a lesson for all of us today, is regardless of how hard-hearted the generation that we live in becomes, that's still no excuse to not take opportunities to teach God's word. Any comments on chapter 10? That's Kemp.
God's word does not return void.
Says God's word doesn't return void.
That's right. He'll accomplish what he intends. Whether we receive it or whether we don't. That's a good point. Appreciate that. All right. Let's move on to anything else. If not, we'll move on to chapter 11. I don't want to get too far. Well, I don't know what I did. We're really going to be, for a while, in our study of chapter 11, dealing mainly with the first two verses. So maybe that will give us time to get those two verses, because the gospel meeting next week, we will, of course, be a couple of weeks before we get back to our study of chapter 11. But let's look at it. What we see in chapter 11 is that the first 14 verses of this chapter is really a continuation of this pause, this interlude that we saw ever since the beginning of chapter 10. In the first vision that chapter 10 covered, we saw the angel and the seven thunders, the mighty angel and the seven thunders in the first 7 verses, and then we see John eating the little book in the latter part, the last 5 verses. Well, 8, 9, 10, 11, 4 verses, verses 8 through 11. Now we're moving to the second vision that John sees here in this chapter. And here we see in verses 1 and 2, the measuring of the temple that takes place. And in verses 3 through the remainder of chapter 11, the statement concerning the 2 witnesses. So with that, both of these visions, again, let's keep it in mind, whether it was the first vision in chapter 10 or now this second one that we're seeing in chapter 11, they're showing the swift judgment, the swift retribution that God is bringing upon Rome. Once this delay is over with, the delay is over. Judgment is coming. So the point of the second vision that we're studying here in chapter 11 is to assure God's people of victory. In the midst of persecution, and like I said, we have never experienced persecution to the degree of what we're talking about here. And so it's, for that reason, it's difficult for us to understand a lot of things of how much it would mean to be reassured that the victory is yours. Because in the midst of this persecution, you're discouraged, you're depressed, you're in fear of your life. You don't know if you're going to live from 1 hour to another, much less 1 day to another. So you got all of this pressure upon you. So for the things that John has been given by the Holy Spirit to write to these people, a message of hope that has been written in symbols, because this message don't need to be understood by the Romans. Remember, where is John? Where is he? He's in exile. He's on the island of Patmos, a deserted island, completely at the mercy for food, shelter, upon the Romans. And here is a letter that has been given to him by inspiration. And this letter needs to go back to those Christians. But it has to be written in such a way as to reveal the message to the Christians, but to hide, conceal the message from the enemy. Because he's going to have to hand this letter off to most likely a Roman soldier who some higher authority is going to look at it and read it. You know, we've got the same situation today in our prison system. In the supermax prisons, when you write letters or when you receive letters, you don't have no privacy. What you receive is read before you get it, and what you send is read before they get it. Same is true here. So that's why we said in the very beginning of our study, the book of Revelation is a book that reveals, but it also hides, it conceals. And it's the symbolism that conceals it. Because again, we're seeing familiar language in the Old Testament that helps to explain the symbolism of what we're seeing here in Revelation. So the Christians that would be made up to a great extent of Jews, having the Old Testament given to them, they would be familiar with the language of the Old Testament. Some of these prophets that, like Ezekiel and Daniel, they wrote in language similar to what we see here in Revelation. So the point of this second vision is to assure God's people of victory. The victory is going to be theirs if they continue to remain faithful. So this chapter goes along with really chapter 7, where we saw, remember, the sealing of God's people, the 144,000, and then we said the other great multitude, which is really both groups, I believe we could very easily say, they were sealed. They were identified by God. And so we see that this chapter goes along with that sealing of God's people back in chapter 7, sealing his people from the wrath that God is going to bring upon Rome. And the last part of the chapter, verses 15 through 19, is the third woe, because in those verses we have the sounding of the seventh trumpet. That third, or that seventh, but that third and final woe that was spoken about in chapter 8. So we see the measuring of the temple in the first two verses. Someone read those for us.
It was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein. The court which is without the temple leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles. The holy city shall they tread underfoot 40 inches long.
All right. So we see the measuring of the temple. John is told to measure the temple, the altar, and those that worship. Now, we need to remember, this is a vision. This is a vision, and it's not to be taken as a reference to the literal kingdom, a literal temple in Jerusalem. Again, remember what we just said a moment ago. John is on the island of Patmos. And if the literal temple in Jerusalem is still standing, then the literal measurement of that literal temple would be impossible. John is where he is, which is far away from Jerusalem. And then there's the big if as to whether or not the temple, the literal temple, is even still standing at this point in time. Because there's some people that take this to mean that the temple is still standing, and they use it as proof to them that John wrote the book of Revelations at the early date, that is before 70 AD, before the destruction of Jerusalem, before the destruction of the temple. So that's one very common take. on what we're reading here in these first two verses and the measuring of the temple. The premillennialists, they take these two verses to mean that the temple will be rebuilt at the coming of Christ. And of course, we know what the premillennialists teach, that Christ is going to come, he's going to sit upon David's throne, he's going to resurrect the temple, he's going to reinstate the law of Moses, and he's going to reign from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. So that's the take they have on these two verses in reference to the temple, that the temple will be rebuilt when Jesus comes again. But what we need to think about is that the temple symbolically refers to the church, since after all, the church is referred to as the temple of God. Someone read this 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 16.
Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwelleth in you?
All right, who's Paul writing to? The church of Corinth. What does he say? You are the temple of God. Literal temple? Literal stone structure? No. But temple in the sense that each individual Christian. And then let's look at Ephesians 2, verses 20 and 21, someone.
And are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord.
All right. Holy temple of the Lord. What? We as Christians that make up this spiritual building. The church is not a physical building. The church is a spiritual building. The kingdom, the temple of God is made up of stones. But remember what Peter described us as being? He described us as being what? Living stones. Built up a spiritual house. So, we didn't get very far, did we? So let's mark our spots. As I said, I regret having to stop at this point, but sometimes we have to do what we have to do. And chapter 11 questions are in the folder, the binders out there in case you don't have them. So be sure and pick you up a copy of it as you leave. Thanks so much for our study.